Hey guys, so I've got another CN speedrunning cup overview. Last time in patch 4.2 I made this video on the single target cup, which I ended up getting a lot of positive feedback on, and it seems like you guys really wanted to see more of this kind of thing. I also made this community post and it seems like you guys like the ideas too. So this time it's called the 4-star cup and it ran from February 1st to February 15th, so it just ended. And basically you speedrun the top half of floor 12 of course, but the restrictions of this competition are that you can only use 4-star characters as well as only using up to 4-star weapons too. So no 5 stars at all. Bear in mind that the Claymore characters, as you can see, are able to use R5 Serpent Spine, which usually in cups is equivalent to a 5-star weapon, but this time it's allowed. So you could consider that a big advantage to Claymore characters like Garming and Beidou. And each run is only allowed one good buff card too. A good buff card is not something like elemental resistance here, but something like elemental damage bonus here. You can pick this in your chamber 1, but then you have to pick random buffs after that. If it wasn't obvious, the reason why they do that is just so people aren't spending days and days trying to wait for the perfect cards, so people are more on an even playing field and it's less stressful. And also one cool thing that they're doing this time is prize money is given out to the top 3 different teams, which is cool, so people can try out new teams rather than the top 3 all using the same team. As they say, it stops a monopoly of old teams like maybe Sucrose National, and it makes things a bit more fun. So just like last time, I compiled some of the results with the links and some of the data, and whilst I think you guys are interested in the overall results, I think especially with these 4-star restrictions is you might learn about some cool teams and strats that you can take and maybe try yourself too, rather than focusing entirely on the results. And there was also more entries than this, but I only focused on the top 8 runs, otherwise the video will be too long. But if you do want to see more entries, then you can click the original post which I've put in my sheet, and then you can go down to the second post here, either in the original text or you can translate it to English, and then you can copy the runs here and see a lot of other teams. So the first thing I want to do before getting into the actual results is looking through the abyss and seeing what is here. I'm sure most of you have already done this. In that case, you may have noticed that all 3 chambers are almost identical. Each chamber has 2 enemies and then another 2 enemies. Chamber 2 same thing, and chamber 3 same thing. It's just these guys twice. And not only that, but each of the waves spawn fairly close to each other, so it's not like you have to run across the map for the second wave. And I think it's fairly obvious that this was done to benefit plunge teams, especially with almost all of the enemies in this abyss being resistant to stagger, meaning you can comfortably plunge away with the new plunge characters like Garming or Shen Yun teams. Now because there's mostly stagger resistant enemies, it also means you don't get much out of grouping except for the last chamber. Now this has a knock-on advantage for this cup because for obvious reasons the 4-star cup won't have Kazuha, so it makes things a bit more comfortable. And the last thing I want to point out is that each chamber is pretty short. You're probably able to 1 or 1.5 or 2 rotate most of these chambers. And with just 4 enemies per chamber and them all spawning very close together, it opens things up for many speedrunners to realistically 1 rotate chambers. And I'm sure some of you hardcore players have been doing that on your own accounts, but obviously with the 4-star restrictions in this cup, it's going to be harder than the average team, but it's still doable as you'll see. So what are the overall knock-on effects of this is that it means if a team only needs 1 rotation to clear a chamber, that means they only need 1 burst per chamber at most, and that means that energy requirements can get very low. So we'll be seeing teams that can take advantage of that and they can focus on maximizing their DPS. And number 2 is, as you know, most teams take time to set up each rotation, which is quite painful if you can't 1 rotate content, because during that second setup your damage drops off. So not only are slower teams going to require more energy recharge, but the gap between 1 rotates and something like 1.5 rotates will be very high. So let's go through some of the teams, and the fastest team was this insane Melt Garming run. But I also feel like most people may not have even considered this specific lineup when they think of melt Garming. I don't know how many people would have thought Diona would be very strong here. So this is the run, and I should say that I have no idea how viable this team is after the current abyss, due to the circle impact, the enemies are ideally positioned for this team, and also maybe some potential energy issues if you aren't able to one rotate. See, Garming's able to get away with very low energy recharge in this run, but at least for now this is a very incredible run to witness. And I think this run just shows that if the conditions are right, as I mentioned, like you don't need to group enemies and they are positioned close together, so you don't have to worry much about circle impact, then it shows that Garming doesn't really need Shenyan or Farina, and he can actually be a pretty strong DPS in his own right. So something I want to highlight is that this run shows a very interesting technique where you actually delay his E-plunge and you make sure that you're positioned well in between both enemies, and as you can see, this helps his AoE quite a lot and he's able to consistently hit both enemies. As you can see, his skill pushes him towards one enemy, so that makes him too close to one enemy, so you often end up missing other enemies around them, compared to someone like Sharou, where you can always line yourself up in between enemies to hit both. There's no auto targeting with his plunges, but as you can see, doing this technique where you slow down and you position yourself, it actually is very helpful to increase his AoE, and you can see this whole run utilizes it to great effect. They're making sure they're in between both enemies and they're melting both of them. And especially considering in melt, you have to be attacking slower anyway, just to make sure that the mobs have cryo on them, so you're actually able to melt. So I think there's a lot you can learn from this run, and this is very helpful in a melt team. And maybe this is something you can apply in the vape teams too, but I'm not really sure how optimal that is. This is also something really cool, but we have beidou teams making appearances here. You can see quite a few people are using beidou teams, and I'm sure you guys know, but 2 enemies at a time is a perfect scenario for beidou, and it lets you maximize her C2 damage here, which is a big chunk of her damage. So you can see one team actually uses Sarah instead of Fischl, and I have covered Sarah versus Fischl in previous videos, but I would say at least Dendro team wise, those videos are a bit outdated now. They are over a year old, and I think it's fair to say, since Fischl got the golden troop set this year, which can increase her damage roughly by maybe 18%, around that, and I think in aggregate teams that this is enough to make Fischl almost always a better option than Sarah, outside of maybe a few Haribo carry situations, and Fischl can often even be optimal in AoE, especially considering Fischl is easier to play than Sarah. But as you can see, overload teams wise, this can be a different story. Whether you're using Raiden or 4-star teams like this, Kujosara's buffs are massive, especially buffing chevreuse, beidou, even Raiden and Xiangling in other teams, and these characters are your main sources of AoE damage. You can see the annoying thing about using beidou is you have to wait to stack Serpent Spine every reset, but it is a very good weapon for her. I will say it's pretty cool, like look at that 187k damage there. It's cool how much damage beidou is getting on some of these counters, but even then I wouldn't really say these are beidou main DPS teams. As you can see, these are kind of like dual DPS teams, with chevreuse also going ham and dealing crazy damage too. I'm sure you guys know by now, but chevreuse is actually a pretty good 4-star damage dealer. Yeah, that's pretty crazy. Overall, this is pretty cool for beidou players. She definitely seems to have new teams unlocked now with chevreuse overload. Just don't expect her to be godlike or anything, and as you can see, even with these 2 enemy AoE perfect scenarios for her, she isn't going to be topping the charts or anything, but that should be expected. I still think it's very cool to see her perform well enough in a team like this, and I'm quite interested in seeing how a team like this can perform in future abysses. So of course, we can't talk about 4-star teams without talking about the GOAT 4-star team, Sucrose National. I play this team quite a lot, and as you guys might remember in my last cup video, the Sucrose National team was very dominant. However, this time it wasn't. But why is that? Well, for one, you could say that this melt Garming run is just too cracked, which is kind of true, but I also think there's another potential reason, which is that the Sucrose National account was actually very busy this patch, entering in multiple different cups and trying a bunch of different runs, even this insane bottom half run they were doing after. And as you can see, this Xiangling damage on Weena is actually cracked. This is insane how it can one rotate here. So the 67-second run was uploaded very early in the beginning of the cup, and it actually was winning for a while. And in fact, the same person simultaneously uploaded a 57-second run, one cost using Mistsplitter on Bennett instead of Sapwood Blade. And of course, that rules them out of entering this run in the 4-star cup. And yeah, as I said, they ended up moving on to different ideas after that. But this is still a very strong entry, and you can see the power of this team. It's able to comfortably one rotate each chamber. The damage is still so high on this team, and there's so much flexibility as always. But overall, I don't know if they just didn't have time to try retake the #1 spot. I mean, as you can see from the 57-second run, there's clearly room for potential for a way faster run. But you know, that is just how these cups go. There are real world factors, and sometimes a team might be very strong, but a player just wasn't available there to get the right run. But even then, this run is still very good, and the team is still crushing, as you can see. Now, I also wanted to highlight this run here. And you might look at this lineup and think it's a heizou hypercarry run, but actually Faruzan is using stringless. So in fact, as you can see, this is more like a double DPS team. I mean, look at that Faruzan damage, and the heizou is not too bad either. You could probably also use Lynette here instead of heizou, but the issue is, unlike heizou, with Lynette you need Bennett at C5, not C6. Because otherwise Lynette doesn't get to use her animate fusion, which is pretty sad. But yeah, I really enjoy seeing the damage of Faruzan in this team, especially because in her more popular teams, like with Sharou or Wanderer, in those teams she uses her burst before Bennett and before any buffs, so you don't really get to see her full damage potential. But as you can see, she has got quite a bit of damage potential, and this team definitely looks pretty fun. Let me know if some of you guys have already played Faruzan DPS, and maybe this run inspires some of you to give it a try get some of those 100k burst hits. So that's the end of the video. As you can see, there was quite a lot of interesting teams there. I will put the link to this sheet in the description, alongside the credits and the links to all these amazing runs by these amazing speedrunners. And yeah, I really liked how this cup had a 4-star restriction, as it gives a fresh look to speedruns, and it can inspire a lot of people to experiment and try different teams that they may not usually try. And in some ways, it can also help you see the potential of 4-star damage dealers that you often overlook in favor of 5-star characters. Anyway, let me know if you guys enjoyed this video and this type of speedrun cup breakdown, and if so, I'll continue making this kind of content in the future too, whenever there's new and interesting cups coming out. And maybe even as my channel grows, maybe we can start hosting some cups of our own. But yeah, thanks for watching, and bye for now. I just want to add that someone came in at the last second. You can see here 11 o'clock 44, so like 15 minutes before the cup ended, and they ended up stealing the win by 1 second, which is pretty crazy. This can happen sometimes in cups. Some people hide their runs until the last second. But yeah, it uses basically the same setup, but they just did it slightly faster.